Truth and Reconciliation in Halo Combat Evolved is a funny old mission. Its first half is very well designed indeed, and yet in my view, Bungie somewhat drops the ball during its second, which does have the odd exciting moment here and there, but also goes on for far too long. And in this video, I'm going to run you through the good and bad of Halo Combat Evolved's brilliant, and at times a little boring, third mission. But as always, before we really get into the swing of things, here's what happened previously on Halo Combat Evolved. Waking up on the ship the Pillar of Autumn, Super Soldier Master Chief is tasked by the ship's captain Recusing Keyes with preventing the AI known as Cortana from falling into the hands of humanity's sworn enemy, the Covenant, who have begun an assault on the ship. After narrowly managing to escape, the pair crash land on a mysterious ring world nearby, and soon after, Cortana picks up chatter on the Covenant BattleNet, which suggests that Captain Keyes is being held on board the ship the Truth and Reconciliation, and so Master Chief, along with a squad of Marines, travels to a desert plateau some 300 kilometers away in an attempt to rescue him. And that's where Truth and Reconciliation begins, kicking things off with this brief scene.
The enemy has captured Captain Keyes and are holding him aboard one of their cruisers, the Truth and Reconciliation. The ship is currently holding position approximately 300 meters above the other end of this plateau.
So how do we get inside the ship if it's in the air? The Corps issued me a rifle, not wings.
There's a gravity lift that ferries troops and supplies between the ship and the surface. That's our ticket in.
Once we get inside the ship, I should be able to lock on to the tracking signal from Captain Keyes' neural implants.
Something this mission, and indeed most of the rest of Combat Evolved, does so well is keep exposition entertaining, but also brief and to the point, and this mission's opening is a great example of that. There's little time to dwell on this wonderfully functional storytelling, however, as you're immediately tasked with stealthily taking down as many Covenant as you can using your sniper rifle. It's worth noting that this likely won't be your first time using the weapon either. The preceding mission Halo has several which can be found during its latter stages, and I like to think that was a conscious decision on Bungie's part. You're given the opportunity to get a feel for the sniper rifle during Halo, before Truth and Reconciliation ups the ante by asking you to remain consistent over a longer period of time while facing a greater number of enemies. And just in case you haven't used the sniper rifle yet, this first encounter is staged in such a way that you still have some time to get accustomed to it and are able to choose at the very least your first shot before other enemies become hostile. The first three areas you move through during this section feature a few clever design choices that may not be too obvious but help keep the mission consistently engaging. The first of these is the way enemies and geography are used to signpost where you need to go next, to make sure you never struggle to find your way and to help keep the mission's pace relatively high. After taking out the first Covenant squad you come across, a group of grunts rushes to confront you from a nearby path, which focuses your attention on where you need to head next. This trick is also used at the end of the second big encounter to similar effect, as another group of grunts emerges to attack you, again highlighting the route forwards. And in this third, larger area, the bridge and the slope path below it are used in a similar manner to direct you to where you need to go, albeit with some lights thrown in around the path in question just to ensure you don't miss it. There's also a nice feeling of escalation to encounters during this first half, with the three areas also getting progressively larger and presenting a more complex challenge each time. In the first area, you're given the upper hand and the opportunity to thin the Covenant's ranks from a distance. They only become aware of your presence when you make a mistake, and so how difficult the encounter ends up being is really down to you. It becomes much harder to stay undetected for too long in the second area, but to counteract this, you're given more room to maneuver after making your way through the first narrow section, which means your sniper rifle remains useful even when the Covenant are aware of your presence. The third area then combines elements of both previous encounters. Like the first, there's a path you can use to move forward undetected, which again gives you the opportunity to stealthily take out as many Covenant as you can. The main part of the area, however, is on a similar scale to the second, which means you'll need to be much more aware of your surroundings, and it even throws in a twist of its own with a Covenant dropship arriving towards the end of the encounter to ferry in more adversaries. This entire opening segment is great, and it remains for me one of the most memorable in the entire series. Even though it can be a bit too easy to be discovered after the first area, Truth and Reconciliation's beginning is nonetheless a brilliant example of why Combat Evolved's first half in particular is one of the strongest in any first-person shooter I can think of. You've had the explosive start on the Pillar of Autumn, a more open affair during Halo, and here Bungie narrows down the game's scope for a short time as you take on a mission mission with a slightly more personal feel. And of course, the excellent soundtrack, which includes classics like Under Cover of Night, pairs perfectly with the brown, barren areas you traverse to really tie everything together very nicely indeed. After managing to survive this trio of encounters, hopefully with some Marines alive to assist you, you'll soon find yourself at the gravity lift you need to use to board the Truth and Reconciliation. And after clearing out the surrounding area, you'll then take on wave after wave of Covenant squads who enter the arena using the grav lift. On higher difficulties especially, this can be a tough fight, but I do also think it's a fair one. Enemies enter the fray slap bang in the middle of things, putting them on the back foot straight away, and the area's large circular construction provides ample opportunities for you to use your sniper rifle to thin the Covenant's ranks from afar. Unfortunately, while the encounter is an engaging affair at first, the amount of squads which need to be defeated means it does begin to become a little repetitive towards its end, and I think it could have been cut down a little in length without losing any of its charm. It does end on a bang at least, as the soundtrack kicks up a notch and the very first hunters ever featured in Halo are introduced. Again, much like the previous waves of enemies, this is a tough fight, but ultimately also a fair one. The hunters' fuel rod cannons have a fairly slow rate of fire and are easy enough to dodge from a distance, which means you're not put under too much pressure while trying to come up with a strategy for taking down this dangerous new foe. Of course, we all now know that a single pistol or sniper rifle shot to the exposed orange area on their back will do the job quickly and easily, but I think Bungie was wise to set up this first encounter with the hunters like this, in order to give first-time players a chance to get used to them. Once the hunters have been dispatched, more Marines are ferried in by Foehammer.
Cortana to Echo 419. We've reached the gravity lift and are ready for reinforcements.
Copy that, Cortana. Hold tight, gentlemen. Foehammer out.
And it's very important these Marines are introduced when they are, and I'll elaborate on why in just a tick. After using the grav lift to board the Truth and Reconciliation, one of the Marines says it seems too quiet. And he's absolutely right. Soon enough, an elite with a sword will arrive on the scene and promptly begin taking down as many Marines as he can. Much like the hunters lose some of their impact once you know the trick to beating them, this set piece is also less effective on repeat playthroughs due to it leaning heavily into its surprise factor. But every game needs a few moments like these, and this is one of the best. It's here that the reason Foehammer dropped off the Marines prior to using the grav lift becomes clear as well. If those Marines aren't dropped off and no others survived from the opening sections, then it wouldn't make for a particularly exciting set piece on the ship just moments later. By including them, Bungie makes sure that the sword elite in question has a ready supply of Marines to slay, regardless of how well you did during the sections leading up to it. Unfortunately, from here, Truth and Reconciliation takes something of a nosedive. In my mind, Halo Combat Evolved has always been comprised of two acts. The first covers everything up until 343 Guilty Spark, and it's during that first half where the game undoubtedly shines brightest. There is a great deal of variety, not just during the mission's moment-to-moment gameplay, but in their aesthetics as well, and each feels like a carefully curated experience. Halo's second act marks the point where things begin to get a little repetitive, with environments often simply being retreads of those you've already visited, and encounters sometimes feeling quite samey thanks to the Flood being a less subtle enemy than the Covenant. That being said, there are a few places during Combat Evolved's first half where you can see that issue with repetition beginning to creep in. Assault on the Control Room's indoor sections are a great example of it, and it's definitely present during Truth and Reconciliation's latter stages as well. Between arriving on the ship and reaching the end of the mission, the vast majority of your time will be spent moving through identical purple hallways, occasionally punctuated by slightly more open areas, and compared to the mission's first half, which wasn't perfect but was certainly memorable, it falls rather flat. However, there is a nice set piece around the midway point of your time spent on the ship, as you and your squad are ambushed by the Covenant in an aircraft hangar. In addition to the sequence with the sword-wielding elite earlier on, and a couple of parts featuring invisible elites later, this is one of the times during the mission where it feels like the idea of infiltrating an enemy ship actually matches up with what's happening in gameplay terms, as you find yourself overwhelmed by a foe who has quite clearly used their knowledge of their surroundings to their advantage. It's during these brief sequences that this part of the mission does occasionally come alive, if just for a moment or two. There's also a solid bit of escalation at the end of this encounter, as you're tasked with taking down another pair of hunters in a much smaller space than when you first met them, although Bungie does still give you an advantage by placing an overshield nearby, something they do again during your third meeting with the enemy, during the next mission, the Silent Cartographer. After more incredibly uninspiring purple corridors, you'll eventually find the cells where Keyes and some fellow Marines are being held, at which point another cutscene kicks in.
While the Covenant had us locked up in here, I overheard the guards talking about this ring world. They call it Halo.
One moment, sir. Accessing the Covenant BattleNet. According to the data in their networks, the ring has some kind of deep religious significance. If I'm analyzing this correctly, they believe that Halo is some kind of weapon, one with vast, unimaginable power.
That's true. The Covenant kept saying that whoever controls Halo controls the fate of the universe.
Like the scene at the beginning of the mission, this one does a good job of doling out exposition without slowing down the pace of proceedings too much. In my view, the biggest step up between Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 2 was the storytelling, with 2 weaving a much more complex narrative. And while I do think 2's story is much more nuanced than that of its predecessor, and it is told in a far more cinematic manner, I do still think there's a certain charm in the way Halo Combat Evolved handles its own story. What it lacks in depth and style, it makes up for in charm and succinctness, and while on the whole it is a simpler affair than later games, I must confess that I still hold it in quite high regard in spite of that. There's a final short section to get through following your rescue of Keyes, and you guessed it, it involves making your way through the same hallways you've just fought through, with the goal of reaching the hangar and stealing a dropship to use in your escape. The AI of Keyes and the rest of his squad is absolutely terrible. I only played through this mission on normal when recording footage for this video, but even then, actually getting Keyes to stay close to you and not quite a distance behind was infuriating, and this section is one that is also burned into my mind from when I previously played the mission alone on Legendary. There's not much else to say other than it is so very, very unnecessarily irritating. What's actually rather great, on the other hand, is the cutscene which concludes Truth and Reconciliation. It's only a short one, but after having perhaps struggled with the hunters you'd previously encountered during the mission, watching a couple of them get crushed might have been for many somewhat cathartic.
Hang on.
Nice one, sir.
Time for a little payback.
And as Master Chief, Keyes and the rest of the squad make their escape, Truth and Reconciliation draws to a close. As always, I can't make a Halo Combat Evolved video without talking about the Anniversary Edition's graphics, and this one for me is a little less clear-cut than many of the other missions I've covered in the past. The Truth and Reconciliation itself is a complete mess of bright colours and overly designed textures. Just look at this hallway from the Anniversary Edition, and then the same hallway from the original. One of them is fine, and the other gives me severe headaches. I'll let you decide which is which. The outdoor section at the start, however, I'm a little bit more conflicted about. Aesthetically, it definitely does away with some of the sparseness of the original, and there's quite a bit too much new foliage for my liking, but nonetheless, I still don't mind it too much. It probably wouldn't ever be my first choice when choosing what graphics to use, but it's one of the rare occasions in Combat Evolved Anniversary where I appreciate it for what it is, which is a lot more than could be said for most of the rest of the Anniversary Edition. Anyway, enough moaning and back to Truth and Reconciliation. In short, much like Halo's campaign as a whole, it's a story of two halves. The first is a tense, well thought out experience, while the second suffers from repetition and poor pacing, despite still having the odd standout moment here and there, which is a shame, because I think if Truth and Reconciliation had stuck the landing, it had the potential to be one of the best missions in the entire game. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans, and do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, as I'd love to hear from you. I also have a Patreon if you wish to support the channel further, the link to which can be found in the description of this video. And with that, have a Merry Christmas, a very Happy New Year, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.